I never had the plan of becoming an entrepreneur. That was the least thing on my radar. Doing something with impact gives you a lot of gratification, I think, and it's not always a solely altruistic thing. It's also a very egoistic thing sometimes. What makes you happy when working at the end of the day? Move fast, fail fast, and then improve and pivot. That's all a nice Silicon Valley mantra. But first of all, realize if you are in a social impact space, your customers are extremely vulnerable. So this fail fast, you make sure if you fail fast, okay, fine, and you learn from it, but fail fast while not impacting your customers.
Welcome to Seedstars podcast, and today I'm very excited to have Sebastian with us. That's the first time that I'm actually meeting and discussing with Sebastian, and I'm really excited to better understand your journey and what you've done. You have received a lot of different awards from the best energy startup in the world, prizes from prestigious organizations.
Welcome to Seedstars podcast. Seedstars is an organization that aims to have an impact in emerging markets by supporting the local entrepreneurs, investing in their ventures, but also sharing their story globally because we really believe they are the true heroes. We'll be listening to them and other thought leaders and disruptors that are really shaping the future of tomorrow, and we hope that together we can build a sustainable impact.
Welcome to Seedstars podcast, and today I'm very excited to have Sebastian with us. That's the first time that I'm actually meeting and discussing with Sebastian, and I'm really excited to better understand your journey and what you've done. You have received a lot of different awards from the best energy startup in the world, prizes from prestigious organizations like the UN, Ashoka, UBS, or Unilever, you name it. But I won't introduce you. I will let you do that exercise. So could you introduce yourself, Sebastian?
Well, thanks first of all, Pierre, for having me, for having SOLshare on this new format. Always striving for innovation, so that I think that's part of it, even though it's enforced these days. My name is Sebastian Groh. I'm originally from Germany. I have been living and working in Bangladesh for the last 7 years now, and started SOLshare, which is a social enterprise working on energy poverty. And there with an innovative feature, which is a smart meter, which allows you to trade your electricity between houses.
Okay. Just something I didn't mention. Should I call you doctor because you got a
No,
PhD?
please not.
No, okay. So I'll call you then Sebastian.
Yes.
Great. So you mentioned this energy poverty. Can you tell us more about it? What is it exactly? What do you mean by that?
So when it comes to energy poverty, there is really no clear-cut consensus what this is, but I don't want to make this an academic lecture, of course. What we usually say is that the easiest, even though with a lot of shortcomings, is how many people do have access to the electricity grid and how many people do not have. And there we have anywhere slightly below 1 billion people who do not have access to the electricity grid. And the whole bracket of energy poverty is another problem, which is cooking. How many people have access to modern cooking facilities and how many cook basically on 3 stones and collect wood for that, or cow dung and so forth. So this group of people, and that is easily a couple of billion people, literally, is considered energy poor.
Okay, understood. And I've also, when researching a bit about yourself, you mentioned a word that for me was the first time I heard, which was, I think, the prosumer or something like this. So basically you were explaining that with your solution, you were enabling people to become some kind of entrepreneurs. So I guess it was a mix between producer and consumer, if I try to translate it. Can you explain a bit more? Maybe you could explain first what's the solution that you're providing to these energy poor people, and then what's this concept of prosumer?
Sure. I mean, we didn't invent the prosumer concept, but we certainly have an interesting application for it. So first of all, a prosumer, as you rightfully said, is kind of a hybrid form of a producer and a consumer, or you could also call it a proactive consumer, so a prosumer. What do I mean by that? For most of us in the global north, electricity is a given. It comes through the socket and it never stops. And at the end of the month, I get a bill, sometimes lower, sometimes higher, but usually affordable for the majority of us, right? And I don't really know what's happening in between. I just know electricity is always there. And I have no say in that. I'm just a passive off-taker. Now, the difference here, what we're trying to do, and I think this is something which makes it interesting, that what we're trying to do here in Bangladesh may very well have larger implications, how we understand energy on a global scale. So if you are a solar home system owner, so now a solar home system is a small solar system which gives you enough power to power lights and a fan and your phones and so forth. So it's a very basic thing. Now, in Bangladesh, there has been a world record. There have been 6 million of those systems have been distributed to those people suffering from energy poverty. Now, if you have a solar home system, you're very conscious of that you have a limited generation capacity because you may have 50 watt peak or 70 watt peak, 100 watt peak, you name it. With our solution now, the big changing factor here is that you're no longer only having the solar home systems for your own consumption, but you can also start selling electricity. And that makes you an active member in this whole setup. Now, we found that in the 6 million solar home systems, about 30% of the power which could be generated is not being generated, is so-called dumped load or energy excess, waste, because the batteries are full and the sun is shining at full brightness, if you have an individual system. So the fundamental hypothesis of SOLshare is if I interconnect those individual solar home systems, I can tap into those 30%. That's what we then call a sharing economy approach, just that it's not cars or flats, it's solar home systems in our case. And it's 6 million of them. Now, the interesting part is there also a large part of the population in Bangladesh does not have access to any form of electricity, namely energy poverty. So what if I can tap into this 30%, which has a value of about $1 billion per year, and can start tapping into it and make this money available to the community, and also electricity to those who don't have any. So the whole idea is giving the people a more active role, that's why a prosumer, and have them exchange electricity between houses who have solar home systems, houses who don't have solar home systems, between households, shops, and other institutions like schools and so forth, who sometimes need more power and sometimes less.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very interesting. So if I just sum it up, your solution, it's basically a household that has a solar panel on the roof, and then this solar panel is connected to your system, and this system is connected to other solar panels, and basically the energy can be bought and sold within this system, right? Is it correct?
That's perfectly right. Yeah, it's a platform, and maybe if I may add one thing. The energy meter, the Sol box, does not show you kilowatt hours. It shows you the local currency. In Bangladesh, that would be Dhaka. In our grids in India, it would be rupees. So basically, you wake up and you have 100 Dhaka, let's say. Now you have a choice. Will you be that day a net consumer or a net producer? And that will determine whether at the end of the day, you have more than 100 Dhaka or less than 100 Dhaka. Those 100 Dhaka are connected to your mobile phone, with your mobile money wallet. So there are 2 world records in Bangladesh we are basically piggybacking on. The dissemination of 6 million solar home systems, but also mobile money providers such as bKash, which have by now been the largest in the world in terms of transaction volume. And that means your solar home system can earn you money. It goes onto your phone, and with that, let's say 30 Dhaka, you can buy a kg of rice in the local bazaar.
No, very clear. So I think that's extremely interesting, all of this. But I wanted also to better understand how you, a German citizen, now ends up in Bangladesh, in some of the slums, trying to put in place these solar panels. So if you don't mind, I'd love to better understand. How did it all start? So where were you born? In what environment were you living? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Now we have to go back a long time. So I was born in a city called Aschaffenburg, which is northern Bavaria, close to Frankfurt in Germany. And what happened is that I went through, from a, let's say, a middle-income family, got a good education, and then was on track to become an investment banker. I actually worked about a year on the trading floor in Frankfurt for one of the bigger German banks. But then in my university, there was a talk on doing business with the poor. And that was in 2008. Yeah, 2008. So doing business with the poor was then a concept which was not, which was quite provocative, I would call it. So I went there. Usually we go to these events in the university because it's free food afterwards, especially if the McKinseys and all these guys host these events. Doing business with the poor, we said, oh, maybe the food won't be so good. But we were interested. And we were students, so you're doing this kind of things. And I was very impressed by a panelist there who was working for a small boutique consultancy based out of Berlin, which is called Micro Energy International. And one of the founders, Daniel Philipp, was speaking there. And somehow he tweaked my interest, and he had very provocative statements in his contributions. So I applied for an internship. So instead of in the next summer again going onto the trading floor, I went to Berlin and did an internship on microfinance, and especially microfinance and energy supply, decentralized energy supply. So I worked a lot in South America and then also in Southeast Asia, and got an introduction to what is a solar home system, how is it financed, and why do those financing often fail, and what is basically missing. I then went in a little bit deeper and went to do a PhD on that. I never had the plan of becoming an entrepreneur. That was the least thing on my on my radar. Yeah.
If I may stop you there, because that's extremely interesting. So for me, there are two things. So on the entrepreneur part, I definitely want to dig in, but I think that's sometimes you just make these, you just meet these people, and somehow it changes your life completely. And I think here what you're mentioning is kind of that, where you listen to that. I guess that was an entrepreneur, or at least the head of a company, and that changed your mind. But I'm just trying to understand why, because I was also at university, I can remember, and you mentioned McKinsey and all the investment banks. That was definitely, at least when I was at university, the way to go. Like everyone, that was the career path. And business with the poor, definitely not something very sexy back then, at least. Plus, indeed, provocative, like business and poor, like seems like a bit of an oxymoron, right? And I'd like to understand, how come you changed your mind? Why suddenly you said, okay, no, not investment bank is not for me. I better go into something that sounds, at least back then, much less sexier than the investment banking or consulting world.
Yeah, I think it's a gradual process, and I would lie if I said that I didn't like investment banking. I got a thrill out of it, like many do, and I enjoyed that as well. But something was missing, and I had always. I mean, it's usually you start with books. I read The Blue Sweater by Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder of Acumen. Which bring you closer. And Yunus also Dr. Yunus got the Nobel Prize for microfinance in 2005. So this was all these years where this went more into the media. And I always had, I wanted to explore more. I went to a university which is very, I would say, very neoliberal. At least the main professors we had were following that school of thought. So most of us were targeted towards Frankfurt or McKinsey or the like. But already among my peers, I see a lot now who have gone to into other fields. There was also the financial crisis then in 2009, right? Was the Lehman disaster. So obviously that all played also a role. I went out of investment before the Lehman debacle, so it was a little bit earlier, but obviously that was also then looking back, oh yeah, maybe that was a good decision, that helped. And it all boiled down then that they're doing something with impact gives you a lot of gratification, I think. And it's not always a solely altruistic thing. It's also a very egoistic thing sometimes. What makes you happy when working at the end of the day? What did you contribute to? And if you get your happiness from doing that, I think that's a really nice mix. And it doesn't necessarily need to be altruistic.
No, definitely, and I think it's very interesting what you're saying, because it represents a lot what we say about the millennials. You know, they're all trying to get this purpose, and I do feel that as well around me and in my generation. And sometimes I must say that I'm surprised of some of people in my generation that are not interested by that are still some kind, for me, in these 80s, 90s mentality where Gordon Gekko was from Wolf of Wall Street was the model, right? Whereas now you have more, I think the impactful people hopefully are getting more and more of a voice. And by the way, that's what we're trying to do also with this podcast, and trying to better explain and understand also this phenomenon.
I mean, it's also hard to say because I'm living now in an impact bubble, right? So, and it's logically in my social media, what I see is all kind of aligned with what I believe in, and other behavior is kind of frowned upon. And I think we all have our social bubbles. So I'm not sure in how far this social impact has become mainstream in my daily life, and what I hear it has. But again, that's probably a very biased view I have.
Yeah, for sure. No, we definitely live in a bubble, and I don't think it represents the majority. However, there are some big trends, like the increase of impact investment in general. Like there's more and more money going into that area. The SDGs, of course, that are a big topic, etc., etc. But also, just to understand something, were your parents or relatives somehow in the impact sector as well, or not at all, or is it something maybe that influenced you a bit?
No, my father was a banker. My mother also, until she stayed home for quite a while for us kids. I have two brothers. I mean, one sister and one brother. So that's not something which came from there. It was just by, I think a deep sense for justice, and that made me read up a lot of those things, and it inspired me. And that led, and then it's not a straight line, right? It's step by step. It's building, and then if you look back, there seems to be a path, but the path goes rather in reality like that.
For sure. Okay, and now so the impact world is quite broad, but you've chosen this energy problem, and why exactly? Why focusing and now dedicating your life to that issue rather than, I don't know, could be education or access to finance or something else?
That was, I mean, outright coincidence. I mean, I'm not an engineer. I'm also not very gifted with electronics. So that was coincidence. I went from the trading floor to this micro energy company, and what they had done was combining microfinance and energy. I was doing courses already in school on microfinance, so that was a very clear interest area of mine. And they combined it with energy, and this was presented to me. And then I jumped on board and never got away from it. So, okay. Yeah.
And it's a for-profit company, right?
It's a for-profit company, that's right.
And why did you decide to go for a for-profit and not a non-profit? That could also, because in the impact world, sometimes you have people just going for NGO way.
Yeah.
What is your rationale? And I guess that touch base on your point before of doing business with the poor. So what was the rationale here?
I mean, I'm living in Dhaka, and Dhaka is one of the capitals of the NGO world. I mean, there are thousands of NGOs here, and there's also BRAC, which is the biggest NGO in the world, which is probably a very good role model. But even BRAC, as the biggest NGO in the world, has a lot of concerns which are social enterprises and which are actually generating a profit and then cross-subsidizing other units of the ultra-poor of the BRAC universe. So, but I also see a lot of examples where NGOs are not very agile, are a lot donor money driven, and not very innovative there. So I'm convinced that under an umbrella of a social enterprise, as long as you can secure this social mission, that a for-profit setup is probably driving you faster. And I think that a lot is more efficient and effective in terms of how you decide things. And like taking it in the words of Dr. Yunus, who coined this term social business, is if you look in, I'm an economist, right? So you usually have a maximization function where you maximize profit. And then you have these clauses and whatnot. So if your maximization function is on a certain social cause, and then all the screws you have, you design to maximize that, then you basically follow the same model as a for-profit company. And which means you also have the same dynamics. And I'm a strong supporter of this approach. And I think if you are an NGO, the dependencies on grants becomes too strong, then you always, I think, kind of have to shift and go like that. So I saw a huge difference in SOLshare, the time we had grants, and then the time when the first time we took equity, and not only social impact, we also have corporate VCs on our cap table. This has brought a lot more stringent follow-up, more professionalization in documentation, in accounts, and so forth. And I think we would have gotten there, but not that fast.
And do you think sometimes there is a misalignment of interest between, could be your shareholders or the I would say the profit-driven approach and the impact part? So do you feel that tension sometimes?
Absolutely, and it's a big topic for us. It's a big topic also. I'm discussing with other Ashoka fellows, because there's a lot of them who face the same thing. We try to have a board of directors which is equipped with both the corporate VCs as well as social impact investors to keep a little bit of a balance. It'll be interesting to see now with the ripple effects of the coronavirus, where some money will definitely dry out, how this affects the VC world and how this affects the social impact world, the impact investor world. So in some sense, it's also kind of a diversification effect, because I can go to both worlds, right? If money dries out in the VC world, I go to the more of the impact investment world, because usually those portfolios are less entangled with the economy. So they may face less of the brunt of a financial crisis right now. So it's a very interesting setup. It has its pros, but it also has its cons, as you said, Pierre, that there may be tensions. We've been so far, it hasn't been, there have not been major incidents, but of course it's on our agenda, and we're trying to maneuver once these issues come up in the future.
Yeah, no, that's something we also very much face as investors, of course, and we're trying to measure both, right? The impact that we're having as well as the financial returns, and we're very much believer that we can have both. We also believe that there are some things and some goods that are public goods, and where it is very difficult to make a return out of it. And then we work very much with a partner that we like a lot, which is the Omidyar network group that you might know, and they have invested more than $1 billion in emerging markets and in impacts, and half of it was grants and half of it was equity. And I think that's extremely interesting, because they've realized also that some of the things you can just not monetize, or that the misalignment would be so big that you better just go with the grant part. And I think we need to be clear sometimes on that, and just draw the line. Okay, here that's not for business. Here that's for that's a public good, and that's grant, and that's also okay. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I do. I mean, the way we handle it, we still get grants, right? I'm not saying that we stopped that, but grants are for very special projects, usually heavy on R&D, which we couldn't go for otherwise, which have a clear track. If they go well, they could become an issue for further equity and could become a profitable model, but maybe not. The risk is probably too high. So that's, I think, important that you keep your pockets clear. Where does the equity money go, which needs to have a return and needs to be paid back, or where debt will go, and the pockets where grant money goes. I think that there should be. But because you mentioned public good, I mean, and I spoke to Omidyar Network about this actually a few weeks back. It's the energy access sector is still looking for a truly profitable business model. I mean, don't get me wrong here. There has been, especially the pay-as-you-go sector in East Africa, has received large tickets by now and has almost become, let's say, very corporate, tapped into real corporate investment. But we still need to see the balance sheets with clear profits. And that's in part because energy access by history has been a governmental task. So I'm just picking up on your public good argument. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes say to people, look, what I'm doing is I have the same model to some extent than an Airbnb or an Uber with some tweaks. But nobody's asking Uber to pay to pave the roads. Mm-hmm. But I have to pay for these electricity lines so that I actually can start exchanging electricity and come up with a fancy algorithm how this allocation is. But nobody pays me my cables. I have to pay them myself. So if you ask Uber to pay for every meter of road where their drivers go on, I want to see their business model, and not even they are profitable, right? So I'm just trying to show the huge gap here in understanding where you are in terms of public good and where it comes in.
For sure. So maybe a last question on the money element, and then I want to switch to another topic. But you mentioned there are billions of people, right? And it's also huge markets. So now, what's your relationship to money? Do you use it as a success factor? And how do you handle that? What's your point of view on and relationship with money?
That's an interesting one, and I think I also observed a change there in me when I was still working in a bank. I think my relationship to money changed to some extent, but then I went into the VC world here. It bounced back a little bit. In the meantime, I was like, yeah, money is there, or it comes and goes, like this laissez-faire kind of approach or lifestyle. No, so I mean, especially now in these days where we see the immediate impact of probably the early signs of a recession, and where everyone is, okay, you need to keep your cash up and your burn needs to go down. For a startup not being profitable, you have a net burn and you always have a runway. So the concept of money for a founder, we have almost 70 people on our payroll right now, has to be very present at all times. Otherwise, this is not very responsible, because you have the responsibility for a lot of people, and that in that case, obviously your relationship to money has to be a realistic one and a very serious one. It was when I was doing my PhD, it was a little different. Every month I got a check from my foundation, and that was it. But I think once you become an entrepreneur, and I'm sure you will agree to that, when founding a company, this has to change. I mean, we cannot live in a fairy tale world there.
No, definitely. I think we exactly live the same, and we have this value at Seedstars, which is follow the money. And sometimes that's surprising, especially in the impact world. But we try to explain to our partners or staff that that's what keeps us alive, and without that, we won't be able to have any impact at all. So, of course, that's extremely important. Now, just on another topic, so you operate in emerging markets, obviously in Bangladesh in that case. I've lived myself in some emerging markets. I've been to Dhaka as well. I know how sometimes
How long
difficult
ago?
and messy. Even last year I was in Dhaka.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
So I grasp a bit the difficulties of these markets from this different perspective. It could be just the traffic congestion to more administrative issues or corruption or other issues that you would face in emerging markets. We're very used to that. But I wanted to know from you and from your end as an entrepreneur, what were the kind of challenges that you have faced that are very particular, I guess, to these markets?
I usually, a very easy one, we learn in school something which is called ease of doing business. And I'm sure you're also very much familiar with it. So for me, the ease of doing business index in one very tangent example is when I tried to set up the company SOLshare in Bangladesh. And set up means getting everything, getting the trade license, getting the bank account, like all papers tip-top done. It took almost 18 months. And after almost 18 months, it was not yet done in Dhaka. We got the first grant, and we found out that you can't receive a grant in Bangladesh as a limited company, because either you are an NGO and then you can get a grant, or you're not an NGO, you can't get a grant and you give a service. But winning a competition is not giving a service. So I was like, oh, so what do you do? I was supposed to get 100,000 pounds from GSMA, and I didn't know how to get it into my hands. So we had to set up a mother company, a holding in Singapore, because that's how it then worked in a legal way. So I flew to Singapore to set up SOLshare International, and it took me 3 hours. And it was done. Everything, bank account, all papers. And the week after, I got my Bangladesh set up. So 18 months, 3 hours. I mean, I think that shows a very nice picture what ease of doing business means. And yes, people laugh at me if I say 18 months. I say, look, do it, but don't pay any Dhaka, which is the local currency, of bribe. Try it. And let me know how long you need. So it's probably possible faster now than 6-7 years ago, but I still think you will need at least 6-8 months. And that is that speaks for a lot more, which is what you're going to face.
Yeah, no, we face the same challenges also in Bangladesh of setting up structures there.
So how long did you need?
It's not done yet, so I'll tell you maybe in 12 months.
Okay.
No, I think that's true. That's a very good example. That's an administrative one, and I guess that's true for a lot of other examples. And as an entrepreneur, and in these past seven years now, right?
Like 6 to 7 years.
Yeah. Did you have some big challenges? I don't know, maybe cash flow issues or some other big challenges that you had to face?
I mean, I would almost say all the time. So before we raised our Series A financing, I think with all the lawyers, and we had to deal with the lawyers in Silicon Valley, we had to deal with the lawyers in Portugal, in Lisbon, and in Singapore, and they all had to agree. And we had our lawyer here in Bangladesh as well as in Singapore. And obviously it took longer than we thought. And then it was like, okay, if this is not closed at the end of the month, the lights go out. So that's like, very close to bankruptcy. And then Microsoft gave us a grant. I mean, we won the Airband initiative, and normally, if you win a grant, it takes a long time that money comes, and usually it comes a small fraction, and then you do something, and then comes the rest, right? Well, Microsoft just sent a whole bunch like this, and that rescued us. That gave us enough breathing space to close the round. So that was it was luck. But some people say if you try hard enough, you get lucky. So yeah.
I think that's very interesting because we like to say that you're a hero. All these entrepreneurs and especially in the impact world are what we call them Seedstars heroes, and we
then we
also
suffer from
realize
imposter syndrome.
true as well as well. but what we realized that they're always like we couldn't do what we're doing also without the support of a lot of organizations around us. You mentioned here Microsoft, for example, that kind of saved you. And it's true for a lot of entrepreneurs I talk to, and even for in our case, we always have these partners that come up and support us, and they're doing a great job. So I think it's also important to mention that because that's not a given. That's really not a given. And sometimes you ask yourself the question, why am I doing all this? Because you mentioned all the challenges you have in operating in emerging markets. Entrepreneurship is already very difficult, even in developed markets, right?
Yeah.
And now I'm facing all these difficulties. Is it really worth it? So why would I not just go back and doing either going back to a corporate life in Europe, making a good living, or even a startup in Europe where I can get easily funding, where there are less of these nightmare challenges that you would face in emerging markets. Do you ask yourself the question sometimes?
I do, and I think everybody should do, and everybody should not do. Let me explain that. I think I strongly believe if you have a realistic view at the beginning of your journey as an entrepreneur, how many problems you will face, you will not start. We have to be a little bit naive and a little bit blind at times. Otherwise, it's too daunting, and I mean, you will give up. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself this question, because if you can't answer it, then you will not make it. You will not last long enough. And we always have this, it's a marathon, and all this talks, it's not a sprint. So you are in it for the long run. And if you're not in it for a long run, then it's definitely not, you're definitely not in the impact space, because impact takes a long, long time. It's not like you set something up and then you sell it off for a buyout or something. I think that's a very unrealistic exit option for any impactpreneur, if you want to label that. So yes, I asked myself that question, and I have my own answer. But at the same time, I'm also not looking at, if I look, what will I if this goes on like this and we have all those challenges, it's keeping one eye very much awake, open, and keeping one eye closed, if I can put this in such a picture. And I think that is a healthy mix to approach that.
For sure. And what would you say now over these past 7 years was the biggest learning from you for you? It could be because if you look at your background, you've been so you studied a lot, then you traveled also a lot in different countries. Now you've lived 6 or 7 years in Bangladesh doing this hard work. What was the biggest learning that you had so far?
It's hard to pin down a single learning, because you literally, that you learn every day actually, and often you don't even realize what you learn. You just, like, every financing round, I'm like, oh my God, if I had known this last time. It's like, you learn a lot on the go, and that's the nature of being an entrepreneur. Yeah.
Or maybe let me rephrase it. If you have a young wannabe entrepreneurs that want to follow your path, what kind of advice would you give to that person, so that you can share with some of this learning that you had?
Yeah, I mean, before giving any advice, which is always probably uncalled for, but we tried a lot of things, and I want to just showcase that through an example. So I read a book which is called Maverick by Ricardo Semler, which is a very interesting book of how we could democratize our workplace. And he wrote that when democratizing the workplace was on nobody's mind. I tried a lot of these suggestions to put into action at SOLshare, and to make SOLshare a different workplace, and a workplace which is extremely attractive for the way it is designed. And but then again, I'm an alien to the local culture, at least in the beginning, and you bring in these things, and it's the foreigner who brings it in. So I had a lot of learnings on you try something, and then you take one step forward and then you fall two back. And then the question is always, how do you react to that? So for instance, we started out and saying, okay, everybody can come to work whenever they want. That's something which is in Europe already old-fashioned probably, but here it was kind of unthinkable. And that was 5 years back, unthinkable. Today we have a fingerprinter where we lock when people come and when people leave. So we're going from one extreme to the other and we're bouncing. The question is, how do you manage to end up somewhere which for your particular case, in your particular situation, surroundings, culture, and so forth, works best? But you will only find out where you end, what is your golden middle path, if you bounce, and you have to try. And I think that would be the biggest recommendation. Just because everyone is doing it one way doesn't mean that there isn't another way, but you will only find out if you try that.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. You always have to find the right balance, and that's definitely the tricky part. So thanks a lot for all this conversation. I think we could still keep going for hours because there's many more. Sorry, I just have one maybe last question, which is for me when I looked at your background, it was very academic, right? But still now I think you're still lecturing in some universities and other schools, and I was wondering. Is there a difference from your point of view from someone that's got a PhD and become an entrepreneur in comparison to, I would say, off the street, hustler kind of entrepreneur? Do you see a difference? And if yes, what would it be?
Let me touch upon first these two different worlds of academia and entrepreneurship. So for some time, at least for a year, I was both. I had my PhD. I finished it being in Bangladesh, which gave me the cushion and cross-subsidization basically for the first year. I always, at the end of the month, I said I always got a check, which was really nice to get, to bootstrap SOLshare throughout the first year. But what you realize is at the beginning, you are just like, oh my God, these academics, they are so slow. And I mean, how can you live in such a world? And as an entrepreneur, you run right, you go at light speed and so forth. But at some point, you realize that there is sometimes a reason for deaths, and you should not. I mean, this, move fast, fail fast, and then improve and pivot. That's all a nice Silicon Valley mantra. But first of all, realize if you are in a social impact space, your customers are extremely vulnerable. So this fail fast, you make sure if you fail fast, okay, fine, and you learn from it, but fail fast while not impacting your customers because they're extremely vulnerable. That's one thing. And whereas going sometimes a little slower and more in depth is probably a good thing. I do teach at BRAC University here in Dhaka. I mainly also do it because I enjoy teaching, but also I want to understand, because these are all MBA students. They're all potential entrepreneurs. So it's really interesting how this evolved over the last 5-6 years, how entrepreneurship as a potential career path has gone from zero to at least somewhere now. And a considerable amount of people, if you poll at the beginning of the semester, actually consider this now as a career path, because before it was not considered, and now it's a very cultural term, good marriage material. You wouldn't get a wife if you are an entrepreneur, because that's not something which is very high considered. Working in a bank is solid. Now to your question. Sorry for the diversion here. To your question, I think it both has its advantages. My co-founders and I all have a fairly solid academic background, which means we go approach things, I think, a little bit more systematic, but possibly at times we don't hustle enough. So again, you have those extremes, and probably there is a golden middle path. I think both are, if to the extreme, are probably prone to, big misjudgment at times. So maybe you want to have a mix, even in the founder team.
Okay. Yeah. No,
we don't have that, unfortunately, but we can still make strategic hires for that. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And last one, what's next? Where are you heading in the next 7 years, actually?
In the next 7 years? Well, we're looking obviously now on our business continuity plans, given the current spread of Corona, also in Bangladesh, India, subcontinent. And we expect, we're raising money right now, and we're raising, let's say, sufficient funds in the fear that we will not be able to raise for quite some time, possibly. So that's probably a recommendation. That stocking up of cash is a very serious challenge for all of us right now, entrepreneurs. So that's something. So we are currently trying to raise an amount which carries us for the next 3 years and which brings us to profitability, which is on the highest agenda right now. More thinking long term is definitely we're working on a model where those off-grid world meets the on-grid world. So a scenario where we can bundle individual solar rooftop systems or solar home systems and manage basically their bundling and their feed into the grid, and then do the settlement, which is probably much more effective than if an individual system feeds in, because they're mostly here in this part of the world too small. So that's something where we are putting a lot of effort in, both on lobbying on the policy side for that, because it could also be a very strong pro-poor approach. If you get those solar home system people, if you get them a community PPA, which means they get significantly more for what they feed in when compared to when they consume electricity from the national grid. That means you could basically be a net consumer, but still earn money, because you get a multiple of money for what you feed in compared to when you buy from the grid. That could be a very strong poor policy. That's something we're looking into very actively. That's one of our latest models we are designing and we are pitching to the government, and we're getting some positive response. So I hope a couple of years from now, you will see this as a new model emerging, a new innovation, and hopefully spreading throughout the world, not necessarily through SOLshare, but as a model per se.
So we hope that will work for you. And honestly, that what you're doing is extremely impressive, and I think it's really going the right way, because, like you said, it's not only in Bangladesh; it can be applied to the whole world, and that could completely disrupt. I think the energy sector, which is one of your 5 Ds, which we didn't discuss, but we can find more on the links that we'll be posting alongside this podcast, so that people can get to know you more.
Make a guesswork. What are the 5 Ds?
The decentralization, decarbonization.
Yeah, no. I'm sure. No, I mean for the audience.
yeah, exactly. So I gave 3. Let's see if they find the 2 others. If not, they can exactly. Google it or find it on our page. Yeah. And I guess they'll dig deeper. So thank you so much, Sebastian, for your time, and again, congratulations for all the work you've been doing. You're a great entrepreneur, like we said, one of our Seedstars hero. I don't know if
imposter
you want to
syndrome. Remember,
true. So maybe we can end up with that. We don't think you're an imposter at all. so that you know. And thank you so much, really, again for your time. If you want to say a last word.
No, just thank you very much for having SOLshare on this. It's been a first. It's been a first. So I hope people find it useful, and I hope it's. All the best for the Seedstars Summit, even though it'll go online in this year.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to our hero's journey, and subscribe now for more stories on Seedstars podcast.